I watched the paint roll down the canvas. It wasn't as thick as I wanted it to be. I couldn't afford to get any professional grade paints for myself, and would have been ashamed beyond belief to have to use the cheap ones high schoolers used. So I made my own. It was messy and drippy, and I couldn't manage to get it to lighten up in color, but it did the job. I'm kind of in a tough place, okay? I wanted to be a painter ever since I was little, but my family didn't support me. 3 months after my 18th birthday, they kicked me out, said I should find a real job. I was homeless for a few weeks, begging for money on the streets when Dan found me. He gave me some loose change and offered up a free meal at the local diner. I couldn't be happier. Eventually, after seeing me on the same street corner huddled together with some old blankets a few times, he let me into his home with open arms. I settled into the basement area with the little possessions that I carried with me. That first night after work, Dan sat with me in the tiny basement, and we would talk about our ambitions and dreams. I told him of my dream of being a professional painter, and he told me of his dream of being an actor. Sadly, though, his parents didn't support his dream. Familiar story, huh? He was forced into the family business and had been stuck with the job as a locksmith for years. But he never gave up hope. He inspired me, so I stayed. His salary was decent, so he was able to surprise me with a couple of paints, brushes, and canvases he had bought for my birthday. I couldn't believe it. My very own paints, but the quality was bad and the paint dripped onto the canvas in big globs of cheap color. I didn't want to ask for different ones. So I did what I could with what I had. I began to research on the home computer while Dan was at work. I looked up formulas of how to make paint like the great painters of the past. But everything was so expensive. I didn't even have money to prep the canvases, much less money for materials to make paint. So I improvised. The first time I made paint turned out to be rough and ruthless. I had mixed in so much crap that I almost thought it was unusable, but it worked. Well, I think it fits well with my subject matter, so I think it's okay. I applied a small drop to the canvas and mixed the paint around, determined to increase my ego by faking my success. It worked for me, I suppose. I asked Dan later that night for some more paint. It took a little while for me to be confident enough to ask him. I don't want to seem greedy. I told him of my formula, and he seemed kind of shocked, but oddly impressed. I led him down the stairs of the basement, and he seemed awed by my painting. He instantly agreed to get me more materials for my paint. It's kind of hard to find something to thicken the paint at times. I research constantly, but my paint doesn't fit the criteria of most acrylic or oil paints. I've tried cornstarch and chocolate syrup and even barbecue sauce. They work sometimes, but not always. A few weeks later, the neighbors reported that their cat had gone missing. It was kind of a shock to hear the news spread so fast around the neighborhood. Dana told me that we would be okay. We were safe. I brushed it off. As the weeks rolled by, I worked on keeping my paint fresh. If I left it out too long, it would stick to the container and darken. I had to prepare the paint quickly and could only use a batch once. It was tedious, but it worked. I could only get a few bits of material at a time, so I treasured the moments I could work at preparing my formula. I thought about selling it, but Dan suggested that I didn't. It didn't come in a variety of colors and still looked kind of sloppy. I decided against selling it. Our neighborhood was pretty safe, but the city we lived in wasn't exactly the greatest. We would hear of news reports of robberies and homicides occurring in the outskirts of the city, and then there was even a slight jump in those homicides this year. The police were forming ideas and patterns but couldn't connect the dots. Dan assured me that everything was going to be fine. I worried while Dan was at work how safe I actually was. I guarded my precious paints and canvases. Dan would laugh at me and tell me everything was fine. He had to leave sometimes during dinner. More calls came in of robberies and people wanted their locks changed. He apologized constantly. And I hid from him the selfish notion that I was a little glad when he left. I got to paint more. But I always had to remind myself that Dan had the car, the means to get my supplies. He had the money, the equipment to get those materials. I was grateful for that. Until the day he stopped letting me go with him to pick up groceries. It was a Saturday evening and I was scanning the aisles of the local supermarket when a lady bumped into me. She had the most marvelous skin and bright, rosy cheeks. She was in her late 20s at most, I guess. Her skin was pale and almost translucent. You could even see the veins in her arms and neck if you looked hard enough. Oh, she would be perfect. I took a step toward her, but Dan saw me staring. His eyes seemed to say, "Not here, not now." He grabbed my arm roughly, and we left. I had never seen him so angry or nervous. Not even when he was struggling through a problem or in a moment of panic. Never. I locked myself in the basement and continued to paint. Even the beautiful subject on the canvas didn't give me ease. The subject was graceful and delicate with pale, translucent skin, but the paint was wrong. It was so very, very wrong. I've started focusing on portraits. I feel it's more appropriate. Dan yelled at me for making a mess the other day. I can't help it if the materials get all over the place. Besides, I like the mess. It's getting more tiresome day by day to hear his incessant yelling. I forgot to clean my space again, and Dan won't have it. He says it gives him anxiety. I don't see why. I tried to get inspired by the garden out back, but ended up tripping on the mound of dirt and face-planting right into the grass. I took it as a sign to go back inside and paint. Dan tried to convince me to switch to digital programs. It'll be less messy, he would say. I just did what I always would. I ran to the basement and painted. You see, I couldn't handle the switch. I loved my materials too dearly. I didn't understand how artists could use a tablet instead of a brush. Didn't they like the feeling of fresh paint dripping from their arms or the feel of the energy in their brushes? The life. I called it. I could feel the life in my paint and it inspired me. I wouldn't switch. Not now. Not ever. Dan found me a job today. Like, a professional one. It means less time painting, but it's a means of supporting myself. That's a good one. I can afford to get my own materials now. I even bought myself my own car. Dan's anxiety is getting worse, but I don't know why. He won't let me leave. I have to go to work. I have to make my paints. I can't stay here all day. I have to have materials for my paints. I have to make my paints. So I faced him. He calmed down and I began to make my paints. Then I left for work. When I came home, I painted. I like the way the color looks. It's dark, rusty. I painted Dan. I wanted to apologize to Dan for the fight we had. I decided to turn my attention to my other canvases for the time being. Maybe I would try to paint the garden again, or a bird. The possibilities were endless. I had one more time to harvest the material. No sirens to distract me from getting all the material. Nothing. I counted my canvases. I had enough paint to cover lots, but I only had 2 left. I decided that now would be a good time to go to the store and get them. I wouldn't have a lot of time before Dan would be missed from work. I tripped on Dan's arm on the way up the stairs. I should really think about cleaning up around here.